This series of events took place when I was still living with my parents. I was a senior in high school at the time, and we lived in a relatively nice, tight-knit neighborhood. We knew almost all of our neighbors, and to our left lived a young couple with dogs that would bark deep into the night. In front of us was an older lady who had just lost her husband, but despite that, always had a smile. And to the right of us lived our closest neighbors, a family with 3 kids, 2 around my age, who I'd grown up with. I could name everyone around our block. We didn't have the typical get-togethers or anything, but during holidays like Halloween, we would all decorate and coordinate neighborhood events for the holiday. And because of this, we were upset when Paul, the father of the family to the right of us, came around to tell us that they would be moving out. Upon hearing the news, I remember going over to their house to talk to the 2 kids. We can call them T and L, who I knew so well and whom I still communicate with. We said our goodbyes, and I had dinner with them. Though I was sad, we promised we'd keep in touch, and I was happy that they were excited for the new chapter in their lives. For a few months following their move, the house remained empty. Some potential buyers would come in and out, but in the end they'd leave. Finally, though, after a while, we saw the signs of the sale and waited excitedly for our new neighbors. It wouldn't be until around a week later that a single small moving truck pulled up outside of the newly sold house. We didn't see the neighbor, as by the time we noticed the truck, we assumed it had been there for a while. I remember my dad leaving the house and heading over to the new neighbors. He said he wanted to offer help and to welcome whoever it was. I won't lie, I always found this to be really awkward, but it's just the way my parents were. Very outgoing and always willing to help. I returned to my homework, and not even 10 minutes later, my dad was back. He's an older man, name's Red, lives alone, but he seems nice enough, I remember my dad saying, sounding slightly disappointed. He went on to tell me about how he helped him move a couch before saying goodbye. He mentioned that the man didn't seem like the type to be open to just chatting, so he didn't push him. We didn't talk to Red much as time went on. Halloween, Thanksgiving, and Christmas passed, and he never decorated or turned up to any of the neighborhood events. I never even really saw him outside of his house. Fast forward to February, and that changed. Only not in a good way. I was working on some schoolwork at the time when I remember deciding to simply take a shower and get some sleep before finishing it in the morning. It must have been around midnight at the time, as that's when I'd typically stop whatever I was doing to get ready for bed. Anyways, I was making my way around upstairs, getting my change of clothes ready, when I heard a noise coming from the right side of our house. I assumed it was just an animal, as we had a crawl space under our house where cats or other animals would like to hide. Only, just to be sure, I decided to make my way over to the window to have a peek. Upon gazing out of the window, I couldn't see much. The outline of some trees and a single streetlight made up most of the image. And just as I was about to close the blinds, though, I saw Red. He was walking towards his house, from ours. I backed up so as not to be seen and thought that either I was seeing things due to lack of sleep, or that maybe there was some other reasonable explanation. I looked out one more time to see nothing. As I was falling asleep that night, I ran through a million explanations, but in the end, I couldn't think of a reason as to why Red was standing near our house so close that I couldn't even see him from the top window. I told my parents about what happened the next morning, and they initially thought that I might have seen some sort of animal. After I explained many times that I saw his face and that I wasn't crazy, they finally said that he was most likely just looking for his cat or something. Despite this, my father offered to go confront him about it. I said no, only because I was scared of what might happen. Over the next few weeks, I heard some noises during the nights, I won't lie, but I didn't see Red anywhere despite checking, so I eventually chalked the noises up to animals and moved on. The time was now around May and school was out. My parents had a little trip planned, and I was staying home to watch the house as I had to attend some informational meetings at the local college I was attending the coming semester. I had completely forgotten about the Red incident, and so when my parents left that evening for the airport, I had only good thoughts about the alone time I'd get to spend in the house that weekend. My first meeting was the following morning, and so I decided that it would be best for me to get an early night's rest. I made my way up to my room and jumped into my bed just in time to hear a noise coming from downstairs. It sounded like a low, thudding noise. Heart racing, I slowly got out of my bed and made my way downstairs, hearing the continued noises. I could tell at this point that they were coming from the crawl space under the house. I immediately assumed it was just an animal and began yelling for it to scram. I stomped on the floor trying to scare it off, and the noises stopped as what I thought was an animal had heard me. I stayed downstairs for another 15 minutes waiting to see if the noises would continue. When they didn't, I decided that it would just be best for me to get some sleep. I turned off the lights, convinced it was just an animal that I had heard, and jumped back into bed again. As I was drifting off to sleep, I heard the noise of a screen door closing. It came from Red's house, and at the time, I didn't think much of this. When I woke up the next morning, I thought about how the animals were getting into the crawl space. I decided that I would stop by the store and get some poison to throw throughout the space after my meeting. I arrived back home at around 3. I grabbed the bag of rat poison, which I hoped would help the animals, and began looking around the bottom of the house for an open vent or a small crack where animals might be getting in. I almost began to give up as I saw what I was looking for, only it wasn't what I expected. You see, we had 2 entrances to our crawl spaces. One was in our house, inside of our downstairs closet. The other was outside, but it took a human to open it, as it had latches. It was open at the time. I assumed that maybe my father had left it open, but nonetheless I found it weird. I decided to crawl in and spread out the poison before closing it back up. Spiders, dirt, and webs filled my face as I made my way inside of the crawl space. It was dark in there and honestly kind of creepy. There were walls inside of the crawl space made of bricks with breaks in them that allowed for access to the entire space, but it also made it a sort of maze. I was spreading out the poison for a good 5 minutes as moving through the space was hard, and I spent a good time killing spiders or moving old tarps. At this point though, I noticed something weird. There was a knife and a bunch of rope down in the space. It honestly was kind of scary, but I assumed at the time that it was left there by my dad, as I could tell that it was under the entrance that led inside of the house, so I assumed my dad just threw it down there. But still, I had no clue what he was using it for. I continued on until finally I had laid out my last piece of poison. I was now in a small corner of the crawl space that was blocked in, and I started to make my way out as I heard something. I stopped instantly as I heard the sound of the entry door to the crawl space being moved. I heard grunts and heavy breathing as someone else had entered the space. Familiar thudding filled the space as I backed deeper into the corner, trying not to be seen. I knew these sounds. I felt sick as I realized everything that I had been hearing and brushing off had been someone, a person under me the entire time. The thudding stopped as it sounded like whoever was inside was now tampering with something. As quietly as I could, I peeked around the brick wall I was behind to see Red. He was lying on his back with a tool in hand, pushing open the entrance to the crawl space. I backed up, trying not to make any noise. At this point in time, I was stuck inside with seemingly no way out. I decided that my best bet would be to just wait. It wasn't long until I assumed Red had opened the hatch, at least from the sounds of it. I looked out again to see him now making his way into the house through the latch before reaching down and grabbing the rope and knife, both of which I now knew were his. I waited to hear the closet door open before making a break for it as quickly and quietly as I could. I made it just to the end before my foot caught on a tarp that lined the floor, making a loud, drawn-out noise. I heard the sound of footsteps from above me. They were running downstairs, and I knew for me. I kept going and just made it out of the space in time to turn around and see Red's face staring back at me from the interior crawlspace entrance. And knowing I didn't have enough time to get my keys, I just ran from the house, not stopping until I reached the house of a friend's that was down the street. From there, I told my friend and his parents everything as we called the cops, and then my parents. I didn't go back home for a few days. The cops were later able to confront Red about the incident, where he openly admitted to entering the house, but his excuse was that he thought he had heard someone inside of it. Despite this, he was arrested for the incident, as from what I heard, it wasn't his only run-in with the law. I still think back to these events regularly, and every time I realize more and more how badly things could have ended up. I realize now, every time I was hearing those sounds, it was him, and that even the night that I had heard the door close, he must have been retreating back into his house, waiting to come back. This happened about 2 years ago. It was June, and I found myself moving across the country for college. For a little backstory, I was planning on going to a community college in the city of Chicago before eventually applying to a 4-year university there. The reason why I wasn't staying home was a little bit more complicated. And to keep it short, I'll just say I never really got along with my parents, and so when high school ended, I knew I had to get out. I'm originally from a small town in Arizona, and I'd always admired the big city lifestyle. I had some friends that I met through the internet who lived in Chicago, and ultimately, that's a large reason why I chose to move there. Back home, I already had plans for my apartment and how I'd pay for it. You see, I had been working since I was 15 at my local grocery store, and so I had a large sum of money saved up. It also wasn't hard to find an apartment that suited my needs, as I didn't really have many. I was single, and I didn't mind living in a small place or in a less optimal side of town. In hindsight, I realized that I was very naive, as I didn't really understand anything about larger cities, let alone Chicago. I recall the day I arrived in Chicago and at my apartment, realizing that I hadn't made the best choice. Not only did the area I was staying in look a bit dirty and intimidating, but the apartment looked as though it hadn't been renovated in years. I couldn't help but notice as I moved my things through the apartment building and towards my unit, the dingy lights, stained-up carpet, and worst of all, thin walls. I mean, I was walking through the halls and I could hear each room I passed as if there were nothing separating us. I heard the screams of sports fans coming from TVs on the left, and the sounds of kids laughing and running up above me. I knew that trying to study in these conditions would be rough. The apartment itself was nice enough. It was surprisingly spacious, and admittedly cleaner than the hallways or elevators I had been through. I remember making my last trip up, carrying a small suitcase which held my laptop and other electronics, when I saw a man open the apartment door directly across from mine. He was a youngish guy who looked to be in his mid-20s, and after shutting his door, he gave me a small nod and simply walked past me rather quickly. I remember finding this a bit odd, but I assumed that he was just a closed-off kind of guy who was in a rush. On top of this, I wasn't the most social guy myself, so I didn't mind the idea of having neighbors whom I never interacted with beyond small nods. Later that night, I found myself watching TV and getting accustomed to the new apartment. I was loving the feeling of freedom, and though I felt a twinge of sadness being away from home, I was excited to start this new chapter in my life. I even had plans later that week to meet up with some of the friends I knew online for so long. Around this time, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching my door, accompanied by whispering voices. I soon realized that it was my neighbor across from me, as I heard the sound of his door opening and closing. I remember letting out a slight smile, feeling a bit surprised that the seemingly awkward guy was able to have more success than me on the dating market. At the time, I hoped this wouldn't be a recurring event, as even now, I could hear the sounds of a springboard under a mattress through the set of paper-thin walls. I remember deciding at this point to get some sleep, as I didn't want to be up to hear this continued commotion. When I woke up the next morning, I remember reminiscing on the horrible sleep I had. I was fading in and out of sleep and reality as I heard noises all night long. Anything from the toilets flushing to loud crashes would continually wake me up throughout the night. I tried to convince myself at this point that it was all worth it and that I did the right thing coming here. My mind was soon taken off of these thoughts though, as that day I remember having a good amount of job interviews. Being in the city, I would have to find some way to make money, as I knew that my savings wouldn't last forever. By the time the afternoon rolled around, I was excited to have the interviews over with, and was hopeful of my prospects. After walking around a bit and paying a visit to my future campus, I made my way back to the apartment where, honestly, I wasn't looking forward to returning. I remember making it back to my apartment just as the sun was beginning to set. I got inside of the elevator, and just before the door shut, a hand reached in. It was my neighbor from across the hall, and he had a girl with him. I recall the girl looking a bit lost. She wasn't talking much to him. Rather, he seemed to guide not only the conversation, but her as well. When the doors opened and we got to our floor, I remember him actually propping her up and walking her to his door as she had begun to seemingly lose the ability to walk. Hey, is everything okay? I remember asking just before he opened his door. Yeah, we're fine, she's just a bit tipsy, he replied before opening the door and quickly closing it behind them. I could hear the sounds of locks closing one after another. At this point, I was genuinely concerned, but I didn't want to call the police as I didn't know much about the situation, and I assumed that maybe it was just his wife or something, and that she was simply really drunk. I decided that I would take a shower and wind down for the evening, as I thought it was possible I could simply be projecting my stress onto others. After doing this, the stress-relieving effects were instant, and I was pretty confident in my assessment of the earlier situation. That assessment being that it was likely nothing sinister. The rest of the night leading up until bed was honestly pretty quiet. Aside from the occasional shower or flushing toilet, I was able to relax and watch my shows. Because of this, when it was time to sleep, I was pretty comfortable and I fell asleep almost immediately following me turning the TV off. A few hours later, specifically around 2 a.m., I awoke to hear screaming. It was coming from the apartment across the hall, and it was so loud it instantly woke me up and caused me to fall onto the floor. I sped to the door, looking through the peephole, trying to find the source of the noise. That's when I heard continued screams and the added sound of struggling. Get off of me! I could hear coming from the apartment across the hall before I heard the sound of something breaking and a male yelling of pain. At this point, clear running could be heard, as well as the sounds of locks being opened. I did it without hesitation. I opened my door just as the neighbor's door opened and rushed a disheveled, frightened young girl into my apartment before shutting the door and locking it. Shortly after, through the peephole, I saw the man coming out. He was yelling horrible things, demanding for a girl named Christy to come back. I noticed blood was dripping down his head. I stepped back as I noticed at this point that in his hand there was a gun. Hey, who's in there? He said as he came closer to my door. I knew I must have made a noise as I stepped back, and so I motioned for the young girl to be quiet, and I tried to hold as still as possible. After a few seconds, he seemed to decide she wasn't inside of my apartment, and I could hear him running off towards the stairs and down them. The young woman, who I assumed must have been Christy, collapsed onto the floor and began crying. Before I could do anything, I called the police and told them about the man. They said that they had already been notified and that they were on their way. I assumed a neighbor heard the commotion and called, and I was grateful for that. At this point, all I could do was wait and try to comfort Christy the best I could. It turned out that was her boyfriend. His name was Dustin, and he was no stranger to drugs. He apparently was on a myriad of different drugs that night, and he had become abusive to her after accusing her of being a demon during his bad high. He was threatening to kill her, and judging by her bruises, I don't need to be told that he had already hit her. She managed to escape by hitting him over the head with a lamp before running out. And by the time she had finished divulging the information to me, the cops had arrived and informed me that Dustin was caught. Later I'd find out that this was not before he would attack another random person, claiming she too was evil and possessed by spirits. For context, I'm a woman and I live alone. I was married, but I went through a pretty rocky divorce a few years ago, and since then I've bounced around from house to house, renting, trying to get back on my feet. This all took place last year. I found myself in a nicer neighborhood than I usually was. Rent was cheap, and I was very happy with my situation. I was even making strides at my job. Things were going so well, I started looking into extending my stay where I was. I got a dog, and I started trying to put myself back out there through different apps like Tinder. Everything started one morning when I was walking my dog. Things were going as they usually did. There were some other people walking around, but seeing as it was early, not many people were out. At this point, I took notice of a man up the street. He was standing on his porch, and due to the morning fog, I couldn't quite tell, but it seemed like he was looking right at me. As I got close to the man, I noticed I was right. He was standing on his porch, just looking at me. His face was covered by the shadows cast by his porch, but I noticed he had a long scar that covered most of his face. As I got closer, I gave a little wave, to which he reciprocated. He then began to watch me as I walked off. Every once in a while, I would turn to see if the man was still facing me, and every time he was, until finally we were out of each other's sight. This encounter definitely struck me as odd, and seeing as the man lived just down the street, it made the entire thing much more unnerving. I tried to brush off the feelings of fear and simply got ready for another day at work. When I drove past his house on the way to my work, the man wasn't there, and for some reason this made me feel even more put off, as I feared he was somehow following me to work. I again tried to tell myself that this was nonsense and that it was just an odd encounter, but I couldn't help myself from looking behind me everywhere I went. Every time, though, my fears proved to be just that. Fears. He was never there. Later that night, I was getting a late-night workout in after a long day at work. I spent most of my time in the women's section of the gym, as it felt more private to me, and I wasn't at the gym to flirt. I wanted to get my cardio in and leave. I was like 30 minutes into my workout when another person walked into the gym. I didn't take much notice of who the person was, as they had a hoodie on, and with the hood up. They walked over to the weight section on the opposite side of the gym. I continued my cardio for another 10 minutes before deciding that I had enough for the night. I turned off the machine and wiped my face before browsing on my phone. I know this next part is going to sound a bit cringy, but I wanted to post an after-workout selfie on my Snapchat. It's something that I like to do, as it helped me stay motivated when I knew people would see if I stopped going to the gym. Anyways, I remember opening the Snapchat app and tapping the screen, accidentally flipping the camera towards the front. That's when I took notice of the other person, who I thought was a girl in the gym. From the outline of the person, I could tell their build was unlike most women, and as I looked into the mirror, I noticed the face of the person, and what I saw almost made me drop my phone. It was the man who I saw that morning, the same scar covering his face, and he was looking at me through the mirror with the same determination in his eyes. I screamed and ran out of the gym and towards the counter. I told the workers, and they immediately ran to the women's gym, only to see the man gone. Looking out of the window, it was clear that the man had left through the back exit and drove off after getting to his car. The employees continually apologized, saying they didn't know who he was or how he got in. I wasn't interested in blaming anyone. I just wanted to inform the cops. The issue was, when we did call them, they told us that without any more hard evidence, the best they could do was knock on the guy's door and ask him about the situation. I was extremely frustrated at this point. I hung up the phone and thanked the workers before driving back home. A million thoughts were racing through my mind as I drove home. I wanted to stay somewhere else, but I didn't know where. I wanted to call someone, but I didn't know who. I arrived at home and rushed inside before locking my doors, closing my blinds, and locking myself into my room. I decided that in the morning I would look for a new place to stay, as I had to get away from this man. In a single day, my life, which had been getting consistently better, was turned upside down as this crazy man followed me around my own town. After a while, I don't know how long, I ended up drifting off to sleep. Sometime later, I heard a noise coming from the window to the side of my bed. It sounded like something was prying at the window. My heart was racing, and I was confused as I tried to wake myself up to face the situation. I slowly inched towards my window, still hearing the sounds. As I reached it, I peeled back the curtains to see the man holding a crowbar, trying to open my window. "Get away from me!" I yelled, before letting the curtains fall back down. I then began to hear the sounds of glass cracking as the man began hitting it with the crowbar. I rushed out of my room and into the living room to find my keys. I finally found them and rushed to my garage, not looking back or grabbing anything else. I went to my car and drove out of the garage with the door half open. With my heart racing, I called the cops again, this time yelling and crying about the mishandling of the situation and the danger that that man posed to me. I'd like to say that they helped me, but again, they claimed that I needed proof. They asked if I had a security system, and when I said no, they offered to station a unit by my house to bait the man. But I was done. I stayed the rest of the week in a hotel and was able to find another place shortly. I even paid to have my things moved so that I didn't have to return to the house. I haven't seen the man since then, and for that, I'm truly grateful.